Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me, I have Matt Abrahams in San Francisco, California. Matt teaches strategic communications courses at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He's also the co-founder of Bold Echo, a Silicon Valley-based company that helps executives to be better communicators. Matt, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Angela. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Well, in your book, you have a book called Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, and you talk a little bit about the anxiety that comes along with public speaking. And I'm curious, if we feel like we're having anxiety when we're interviewing for a new job, is there anything that we can do to kind of manage our anxiety?
Sure thing. In fact, I think the anxiety that comes with interviewing is very similar to that comes with any high-stakes communication, be it a presentation or running an important meeting. And there's some fundamental things that we can do to manage that anxiety. And I use manage very carefully. I don't know that we can ever overcome the anxiety, but I certainly think we can manage it so it doesn't end up managing us. And so a couple things to suggest straight away. And this sounds strange, but practice is critical. You know, if I told my coaching clients or my students to practice a presentation before they give it, most people would say, sure, that makes sense. I might not be comfortable doing that, but it makes sense to practice. The same thing is true with interviewing. Role-playing, thinking about questions, speaking the answers out, very critical. So the more you practice, the more confident you can feel going into these situations. And then the second bit of advice I would give is many of us carry with us this notion of wanting to give just the right answer. And this is really related to performance anxiety. You know, if any of your listeners have ever done any singing, dancing, acting, or played a sport, they're familiar with this notion of wanting to get it right. You know, in acting, there's a right way to do it. You got to say the lines in the right way at the right time. In sports, there's a right way to do what you're supposed to do in your sport. So we come to interviewing, we come to high-stakes communication with this notion of wanting to do it right. And I'm sure you'll agree with me in this, that there is no one right way to communicate. There is no one way to answer an interview question. So we have to see our communication not as a performance where we have to get it right, and we need to see it as something else. And I'd like to argue that a conversation is a great way of reframing an interview. You're really just having a conversation and a dialogue. So it's important to go in with practice, but also looking at this as a conversation and not a performance. And that can help reduce anxiety for sure.
I like that. You know, it makes me think when you say practice, last year I gave a talk and I was practicing at a theater for my talk ahead of time, like quite a bit. And somebody came into the theater who also was there to practice, and it was a ballet dancer. And the woman that was helping me with my speaking coach, she said, you know, you should pay attention, take note of this ballet dancer, because oftentimes in corporate, when we speak, we go and we speak once and we move on. And so we don't practice it the way we would practice a sport. And not necessarily to get it perfect. Like you said something that was really important about not trying to get it perfect. But I think oftentimes we just don't practice enough because we look at it in such a different lens than we would look at something like a sport.
That's right. That's right. And we can take learnings from other communication events and other types of interactions with people and learn from those to inform the way we interview, we present, we communicate in meetings. So I think that advice was great.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, for sure. Well, so I'm curious, one of the things that I think often happens when we're in a job interview is we start to get really worried about, you know, am I getting the job? What's going to happen? It's like we stop being present and we go into our mind. And I think sometimes this isn't the best technique when we're in an interview. And I'm curious, do you have any suggestions for us on how we could be more present there in that moment in the interview?
You've hit on something really important, Angela, and thank you for asking that question. A lot of our anxiety in interviews and in other high-stakes communication comes from being future-oriented. We're afraid of the potential negative future outcomes of what could happen if I don't get the job, or if I answer the question this way, it might not set me in a good light. And that future focus gets in the way of us really connecting and being conversational. So my recommendation to be more present-oriented falls into a couple different techniques. First, spend time really connecting with the person you're interviewing with and talking to. So engage in some dialogue and some banter and really pay attention to what they're saying. Challenge yourself to ask a question about something that they say to you as you greet them or meet them. So you might ask if they have plans for the weekend or how they've enjoyed their summer. That really forces you to be in the present moment and not thinking about what could or could not happen in the future. Prior to actually meeting the interview person or people, you might want to do something to get you in that present moment. Going back to speaking about athletes, a lot of athletes, before they perform their sport, will listen to music, a song or a playlist to get focused. Doing something physical, taking a walk around the building to help clear your head, get you into your body can help. I do something kind of silly, but it really helps me get present-oriented. I count backwards, starting at 100, from a challenging number. I'll pick like 17s or 13, and try counting backwards from 100 by that challenging number. And the only way to succeed is to be in that present moment. So getting yourself present-focused, being in the here and now, really makes a difference in terms of the connection you can make with the person you're communicating with. But it also mitigates that anxiety, as you rightly pointed out, that comes from the potential negative outcomes in the future.
Mm-hmm. I agree. The thing I think we often focus on when we start to be in our own head is, am I answering every question perfectly? But it often comes down to that connection, like you mentioned. And you're probably going to be hired because you've had a great connection with the hiring manager, not because you were graded perfectly on every answer. No one is recording you and scoring your answers. But they are paying attention to, is this someone that I like? Do I want to work with them in the future? So I think you shouldn't quite have that expectation. I mean, I often compare it to when I go to like a comedy show. If I go to listen to a stand-up comedian, I don't remember what their jokes were. I remembered if I had a good time. And I think it's kind of similar in the interview as well.
I really like that analogy. You're exactly right, that it's how you feel about the experience in the end. We don't remember a lot of content we hear, but we absolutely remember the feeling we have while hearing that content.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Also, one of the pieces of the communication puzzle is body language, and that's something that influences how people feel about us as well. I'm curious from your perspective, how important is body language? And, let's just start there. Is body language, in your opinion, important in this process?
It's critically important, and there's a lot of research that suggests the way you say something is almost more important, and in many cases is more important than what you say. And interestingly, your nonverbal body posturing and the way you use your voice not only influence how people see you, but it influences how you yourself feel. Mm-hmm. So it's very critical to be thinking about how are you coming off in terms of your nonverbal positioning of your body and your voice. And the single best tool is to record yourself. So as part of this practice and preparation I mentioned earlier, digitally recording yourself and then watching it can be very insightful. And I'm sure if you've ever worked with a speaking coach or in the work that you do, Angela, that digital recording is a tool that you can leverage to really help people.
Mm-hmm, for sure. I'm curious, so say we're in an interview and someone's interviewing us and we're aware of body language, we have good posture, but we're trying to decide, does the other person like us? And maybe we're trying to read into them and their body language. Do you ever have any pointers on things we might pay attention to see if the hiring manager is engaged with us, if they're interested, or if they're maybe tuning out?
So it's a tough question because there is no one sign or symbol that somebody does to signal interest or not. But clearly a constellation or pattern of behavior could be informative to you. So is the person leaning in? Is the person nodding? Is the person paraphrasing and leveraging information you've said? Are they looking away, leaning back, crossing their arms? These are all clues and cues that might signal their level of interest and engagement. But again, it's not a perfect science. I'll give you an example. In the teaching I do, I had a student who was nodding the whole time I was talking. I thought he was just incredibly engaged. Well, what I didn't tell you is he was wearing a hoodie And when he dropped his pen on the ground, I saw that he had earbuds in. He wasn't even listening to me.
Oh, dear.
Sometimes what you see is not what you get. So I would hate for somebody listening to this to say, well, the person who's folding their arms in front of their chest is disengaged and I'm doing poorly, when in fact the person could just be cold. So I look at it in terms of patterns. So if somebody's doing several things that lead to signal perhaps disinterest or disengagement or the opposite, engagement and interest, then they might be informative. But if you just see one thing, I would hate for somebody to get thrown off just by that one behavior.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point. And also, there are some hiring managers that do their best to kind of hide any signals. They want to be super neutral. I never quite understand that, but I think that can make it harder.
The first date I ever had with my wife, when she asked what I did, we met in graduate school, and I said I studied nonverbal communication. I kid you not, Angela, she sat without moving a muscle for an hour and a half because she didn't want to give me any cues if this was going well or not. But thankfully, it went well.
Oh, no, that's too funny. Well, one thing, so you talk a lot about giving presentations and public speaking, and it doesn't come up in that format all that often in an interview, but it actually does sometimes. And I will say, when I graduated from college, or as I was coming out of college, I interviewed at this company called Carrier. And I was interviewing for like a sales engineer position because I started in engineering. And the hiring manager we were meeting in his office like a normal interview, and he gave me a pen, like a dry erase marker. And then he pointed to a whiteboard and he said, I'll be back in 5 minutes. You're going to give me a presentation all about why I should hire you. And he left the room. And it was really fun. But, I think when things come up like that, it can be tough. And there are other situations too, other companies. I think like Glassdoor is actually one of these companies. When they interview for their company to actually work at Glassdoor, you do a presentation at the end about yourself. And I think you know about it ahead of time. But if we find ourselves in this situation where we're giving a presentation as part of an interview, do you have any tips for us on how to really do a good job?
Sure. There are lots of things I could say to this, but when you're put on the spot to give a presentation, there are really two fundamental things you have to accomplish. One is focusing on what you're going to say, and second, how you're going to say it. And I am a huge proponent when answering questions or giving presentations of leveraging structure. I think structure is critical. And if you can invoke a particular structure, you halve that burden that you have by helping you with how you're going to say it. So let me introduce you and your listeners to my favorite structure that can be used in these spontaneous situations. It's called the what, so what, now what structure. And you start by describing what. In your case, it could be what it is you bring to the table, the skills you bring, the background, the passion. The so what is how those skills, that background and passion are directly relevant to the job. So it's the value that you provide. So what is the value you provide to the person you're speaking to? And then now what would be the next steps where you could talk about what you intend to do if you're hired on that first day or a first project you might work on. So by having that structure of what, so what, now what, in that moment, you know how you're going to answer the question or give the presentation. You just have to decide what information you put into that structure. And it makes it so much easier when all you have to do is think about what content do I want to put in the structure than trying to juggle both. So I encourage everybody listening to think about how you can structure answers in interviews and presentations you give, and heck, even emails you write in that what, so what, now what structure. And it just makes things so much clearer and so much easier for you and the person who's listening to you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great advice. In this situation where I was given the dry erase marker, I think I immediately looked down at my resume. I circled the things I wanted to talk about because I was supposed to present about myself. And then I sketched kind of like just a quick outline on the dry erase board about the topics that I wanted to cover. And then when he came back in, I just sort of went on, an extemporaneous talk about, basically a slightly longer elevator pitch, so to speak, where I was able to hit on those points. And it ended up coming out really well, even though it was something that wasn't planned.
That's awesome, and congratulations for that.
Thanks. It was a long time ago, but it was definitely one of those situations that was a little unusual, so I've remembered it. So in one of your workshops, I saw that you talked some about conversational language. And what I mean is language that provides inclusion to other people. And I will have to say, this is a pet peeve of mine. I really dislike it when people use a lot of lingo and when they talk in a way that feels like they're trying to exclude other people. But from your perspective, when it comes to looking for a job and interviewing, when is it appropriate to be conversational versus more formal?
Yeah, it's tough to really ascertain that. You have to do some reconnaissance and reflection before you go into these interviews. So researching the company, looking at the language they use on their website, looking at some of the LinkedIn profiles of people who work there, perhaps if you know who your interviewer is, and understanding the language that they use, looking at their client list and seeing who the clients are that they serve, their customers. All of those can be clues as to the level of formality that you might need to use, but also being just a really good listener and listening to the people that help you set up the interview, listening to the way the questions are phrased. Those can help you determine what level of formality you should use. Now, I can tell you that there's a tremendous amount of research that says conversational language, inclusive language, words like us, you, we, that it actually brings people closer together. It's more engaging and ultimately more memorable. So if it's appropriate, given the research and reflection and reconnaissance you've done, to use more conversational, more informal language, then I highly encourage people to do that. But again, you're right. You have to make sure it's appropriate given the audience you're speaking to.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting. My corporate career most recently was in digital marketing. And when I started in 2006 in digital marketing, there was not an education for it. And so when you meet other digital marketers, one of the ways they would be able to tell how senior you were was who could talk a bigger game in terms of using technical terms. And for me, even though I can play that game, the minute somebody approaches me and starts to use really complex, terms or acronyms, my brain just turns off. I'm not interested. And so I think you're right. I think it's also about who is the person you're talking to. Are they, someone on another team who doesn't understand the technical details of what you do, or is it your boss who does understand and wants to see that you know the difference? I'm not sure. But I definitely think when you use too much very specific language, it can just turn people off.
Absolutely, yeah. No, using jargon and acronyms can really be off-putting and confusing to people. And yeah, I've been around doing my coaching and consulting long enough to have been in lots of companies where the same acronym means different things. Mm. So you really have to be careful. There's something called the curse of knowledge, where we all just know too much about what it is we speak on. And because of that curse of knowledge, we make assumptions, we use jargon and acronym, and it gets in the way. So we really have to think about making sure that our audience can understand us in terms of the language we use and the tone we provide. And that really can make a big difference in achieving our communication goals.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. And it is interesting you mentioned how the acronyms can mean different things. And sometimes we're just not even aware of it. But, I think many folks, like when we go out and we're looking for a new job, we're looking for something that is a step up. It's a higher level job. And oftentimes the higher that you kind of go up the food chain, I think the more is expected of you from a communications perspective. And if we're interviewing for something that's higher level, higher profile than we currently have, what are some of the things that we can do to take our communication to the next level so that we're able to prove ourselves for that job?
Sure, and you're exactly right. The more access and influence you get in your career, the more the expectation is that you can communicate effectively, and we have to prepare ourselves for that. So first and foremost, I think it's awareness, just knowing that that's important. A couple of suggestions I have. One is observation. See what people do, what makes people successful. The only way to get better at any skill, I believe, especially communication, is three things. It's repetition, reflection, and feedback. So first, you have to do some reflection. What works for you? What works for other people? Second, you need to find avenues to get opportunities to practice and learn. Now, this is going to sound a little self-serving, but as somebody who's a communication coach and somebody who teaches communication skills, I think making yourself available to classes and coaching is really important, and there are lots of opportunities to do that individually or through big programs. I'm a big fan of Toastmasters, for example, but also getting feedback. Find trusted others who can mentor you and give you some input, and that's really how we get better at it. It's not something you just think about or read about. Communication is something you have to do to get better. So being aware is the first step, and then taking action to learn, take action to get feedback and reflect are absolutely critical to helping become a better communicator, but also to further your career as you move up in an organization.
Oh, that's great. I'm curious with Toastmasters, do you feel like what types of folks sign up to go to Toastmasters? Is it just people who want to be professional speakers, or are there different levels of people that might go to the same Toastmasters event?
So I'll say what I'm about to say about Toastmasters is true of courses that I've taught and courses that I know are available in coaching as well. There are a subset of people who want to be speakers, professional speakers. And in fact, Toastmasters has a whole different branch of their organization that focuses on that, allowing therefore others who just want to improve their communication skills to take advantage of what they offer. And the same is true of courses and coaching you can take. I have been privileged enough to be invited to many, many Toastmasters organizations, groups to present and talk. They have an education component, so they bring people like me in. And each one is different, even though they follow the same format and the process. They feel different. Their areas of focus are different. So I would encourage your listeners to check out Toastmasters. They're all over the place, and they're very reasonably priced for what they do. And if you go to one and the fit doesn't feel right, I would suggest going to another and see. Ultimately, I believe you'll find a home that works for you through that program.
That's a great idea. I mean, I think, it could be an excellent resource no matter what. I think also one that you kind of were probably alluding to, but I've done in the past, is actually to go and take a theater class. Like a community theater, or I've seen a number of people lately who are doing stand-up comedy classes.
Oh, wonderful.
And they're not people
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
They're not people who are stand-up comedians, but they're people who want to learn how to be better storytellers, and it's a really good place to sort of figure that out.
So the reason I got so excited there is I'm a huge proponent of improvisation. I think improv is one of the best skills somebody who wants to become a better communicator, a better interviewer, can take part in. And improv, while it has a comedy component, is really about just helping you in the moment come up with responses that are appropriate, that are connected, that are engaging. And I often recommend to my students and the people I coach as a next step beyond the work that I do with them, beyond Toastmasters, that looking into improvisation is a really useful way to hone your skills and get better at communicating. And, by the way, have a heck of a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, so the opposite of improvisation would be memorization. And This is a little off topic from the rest of the questions, but I totally wanted to ask you this while we're here together. Last year, I gave a TEDx talk, and I'll tell you, it was one of the things where you had to write a script, have the script approved and, get feedback, and then you had to memorize it. And so there was no teleprompter at all. And for me, that was probably the hardest part about doing the talk. Wasn't actually doing the talk, but just being able to memorize it. I'm curious, for those of us who might struggle with memorization, what tips might you have when it comes to this kind of public speaking?
So first, let me say I've watched your talk, and it's a great talk. So congratulations on that. But I really struggle with this issue. I am not a huge fan of memorizing, and I've done a lot of work coaching people on very high-stakes presentations like TED Talks, like TEDx Talks, and I've done some myself, and I really, it pains me when people are forced to memorize. What I would recommend, so I'm going to give you my recommendation for what to do instead of memorizing, and then I have a few tips for memorizing. Rather, I would prefer people speak from an outline. And an outline is just key points that get across the ideas that you want to communicate. They're triggers to help you remember. Now, if there's certain key ideas that are just critical, you might write those out completely and become very, very familiar with them. And I distinguish between familiarity and memorization. What I do, and seems to work for many people, is my outlines are actually question-based. So if you look at one of my lectures I give or a talk I give, it's a series of questions. And I remember the questions, and then I just answer them free form when I'm up in front of an audience. So I, of course, follow a structure. And this allows me to be more conversational, more in the moment, and it allows me to be more connected because I'm simply answering my audience's unasked questions. And I find that works really well. Now, if you are in a situation where you have to memorize, I recommend, and this is based on memory research, doing what's called focused practice or chunking, where you don't try to do everything all at once, but you take small pieces, and then you practice those pieces in a varied order, so you don't always go in the same order. And that helps you to modularize the content, so that if you blank out somewhere in the midst of reciting your memorized speech, and that's the biggest fear, is you blanking out of a memorized speech, because you practiced it in blocks or chunks, you can catch up and start the other chunk. It doesn't lose the whole flow. So that's the best bit of advice I have for memorizing if you have to, but I would really encourage people not to memorize.
I know, right? I agree. I think for me, the thing that ended up helping the most is I tend to remember things that I hear better than things that I read. And so I recorded myself and I listened to it a few times, rather than just to read it. And that helped quite a bit. I think the other thing that was really tricky and I think is hard for someone like me who does not come from a theater background is in that day for the particular talk, the order of the participants got switched up. And so I ended up going about an hour sooner than I was supposed to with no notice. It was just put the mic on, go out there. And because of that, it actually mixed up the sound crew. And so when I went out and started speaking, the microphone was off and no sound was coming back to me. And I knew it and no one else knew.
Oh, no.
And so that was actually very difficult because you wonder, like, what am I supposed to be doing? And in my case, I just kept going. And we went back and overlaid. We dubbed the talk, actually, so you probably didn't notice that. But
I didn't notice that at all. I was actually marveling at how you managed.
Oh, thanks. But I'm curious if you ever give tips for folks when something goes wrong as you're giving your talk, what they're supposed to do.
So I do, in fact, and there's a whole chapter in the book I wrote on this. And so first and foremost, you should, in advance, think about things that could go wrong and come up with contingency planning. So, when you fly on an airplane, the flight attendants tell you what to do if there's an emergency in advance of that emergency. So if it were to happen, God forbid, you know what to do. We should think about things like that and come up with plans in advance so we're not as surprised, so we're prepared. So the first thing is do some contingency planning. You're not going to hit every contingency and every potential thing, but it can help you feel more confident. When something does go awry, try not to acknowledge it if you can. The worst thing to do, a nervous speaker who gets up and is about to give a presentation says, "Oh, I'm so nervous." All you do is call attention to the anxiety or to the mistake. So simply try to work through it without acknowledging it if you can. And it sounds like you did that very well, at least in what I saw of your talk. When it happens, a great thing to do, for example, if you blank out, is go back to go forward. If you lose your keys, the way you find them is you retrace your steps. So if something goes wrong, go back and paraphrase what you've said before to move forward. Another great thing I do, or recommend, I do this, but I recommend others do it, is have a question or two in your back pocket that you can ask if you blank out or if something goes wrong. So you could just pause and say, "I'd like to take a moment to ask this question of you." So when I lecture, I'll let all my former students in on a secret by sharing this with you. If I can't remember where I want to go next in a talk, I will simply pause and say, "I'd like for each of you to take a moment and reflect on something we've just covered and how you can apply it in your next communication." And everybody thinks that's great because they're thinking about it. They might even turn and talk to somebody about it. And while they're doing that, I'm recomposing myself. I'm figuring out how to manage whatever's troubling me, etc. And they don't know it because I've, in essence, distracted them with something that's meaningful. Mm-hmm. So those are some tips for dealing with challenging situations. Plan for it in advance, contingency planning. Don't draw attention to it. Go back to go forward if you forget, and have a back pocket question in advance that you can leverage if something happens.
I think that's a great idea. The talk that you saw of me is the full talk. So there was nothing that happened before that you didn't see. But I had not planned for the contingency of going an hour early and having there be no sound. So I was able to, it made me think of, because I had not done this contingency planning. When I was a child, when I was about 5, I took dance classes, and you would have to do a dance recital at the end. And the teacher would say, no matter what happens, if your costume falls off, no matter what happens, you just keep dancing. And in that moment, I thought, well, I guess you just keep going because I have no idea what else you're supposed to do. But it was definitely a learning experience. And I will say it became much harder, like we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, staying more present and how important it is to stay present. It was very tough for me to stay present in that talk because I knew that the sound was out. But it was a huge learning experience. And I definitely think if I were to do it again, I would feel more comfortable the next time around. So it was practice.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how life experience, like when you were 5, helped you in a situation when you were much older?
Right.
Something else that I recommend people do in general to help with anxiety, but also challenging situations like you described, is remember that your job when you're communicating, presenting, running a meeting, interviewing, is to be in service of the people you are communicating to. You're there to help them in some way. So if you're interviewing, you're there to help them better understand how you're qualified and can help them with whatever the role is you're interviewing for. So if you're in the midst of a communication that goes wrong for some reason, by reminding yourself that you're there to help them, it's not about you and the trauma that you're potentially experiencing. Mm-hmm. It's really about helping the audience. That can help you persevere and get through it rather than saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is happening to me, et cetera. It's not about you, it's about them. And that can really help in many situations, reduce anxiety and help you get through troubled situations.
I think you're right. It takes the focus off of ourselves and kind of takes the pressure away. Well, Matt, this has been excellent. If we want to learn more about you and your work, where should we go?
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Angela, and there are a couple places I'll point people to. So the book I wrote, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, has a lot of the tips and tricks we've just talked about and many more. And it's not just for presenting, it's for communicating and interviewing as well. I have a site for people who want more coaching and to learn more. A consulting company I co-founded is called boldecho.com. We want people's messages to be presented in a bold way, and we want them to echo long after they're gone. And then finally, for those people who have anxiety as a major issue, there's a website I curate, has a lot of free resources called nofreakingspeaking.com. And that's a good place for people to start if you are an anxious communicator.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. Well, I'll put links to those in the show notes so that we can find you and find your book. And anyway, Matt, thank you for joining me. This has been excellent.
Thank you, Angela, and best of luck as you continue this podcast.
Thank you for listening. And if you've enjoyed the show today, please don't forget to help me out. Go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Copeland Coaching. It helps other job seekers find the show.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.